Second to finish loading, and then we'll be ready to go. And it looks like it is working. Yes, that's always helpful. Okay. We'll just give it a couple seconds for people to finish logging in through YouTube if that's the way they wish. As always, if anybody would like to join us on Zoom rather than YouTube and get the perfectly up-to-date rather than the slightly delayed experience, just let me know and I'll be happy to share with you the Zoom link. Of course, that only counts if you're watching it in real time. It also makes it easier to participate. And if you can't, well, then I'm glad that you're joining us in the recorded version. I should point out that you're welcome to ask questions in the comments. It's not quite as interactive, but I always enjoy hearing from other people studying what's on their mind. Okay, with that introduction giving us just enough time to let people log in, we can't delay anymore. Let's get down to work with Vayakhel. So here we are, chapter 35 of the parasha, of Exodus and Parashat Vayakhel, and we are resuming our story of the construction of the Mishkan. This whole last half of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, is a little disjointed as far as the narrative goes. As I've mentioned many times before, there are different opinions within our traditional commentaries of exactly where everything happens on a timeline. But one thing we do know is that eventually the Mishkan will be built by the end of the book of Exodus in that narrative, after everything else has finished. And then, of course, the book of Vayikra begins with the actual rules for using the Mishkan, using the tabernacle itself. But among the many digressions, it's the wrong word because it sounds like it's not intended, among the many different topics that pop up during this overarching theme of the building of the Mishkan is the topic of Shabbat. And this may seem a little unusual. As I've explained before in other classes as well, the juxtaposition of Shabbat and the building of the Mishkan is used by rabbinic tradition to explicate exactly what God means when he says, don't work on Shabbat, when he says that we should not do any melacha. That term is left unexplained in its first instance in the Ten Commandments, but we do get a few glimmers here and there of some examples, gathering, preparing of the manna. We'll see later on the gathering of firewood, and we'll see today the kindling of fire. But the vast majority of the details of what counts as work and what doesn't are discussed with the juxtaposition of the building of the Mishkan and the prohibition on Shabbat. The simple logic being that God mentions the prohibition on work next to the work of the Mishkan in order to teach us that just as the Mishkan's work could not take place on Shabbat, so too could any of that same type of work not take place on Shabbat, even, or I should say, especially for any less important reason. As always, there was the caveat to save a life. Of course, we violate Shabbat in a heartbeat in order to save a heartbeat. However, in the normal run of the of matters, we don't engage in any of the work of the Mishkan on Shabbat, and that means, any of the actual construction work. Ironically, the actual utility of the Mishkan does continue, meaning that the needs of the sacrifices that take place on Shabbat, that are commanded to take place on Shabbat, as we see much more in the book of Vayikra, those do continue during Shabbat. But the construction, which was done by the rank and file individual people, that was not allowed on Shabbat, and so too any of our own labors of similar type. However, as simple as that might seem, I know it does take a while to get your head around it, and see one of my Pathways to Judaism courses on Shabbat to see all of those labors that are enumerated in more detail. But there are a couple of little outliers that crop up, and those can teach us interesting things beyond the general categories. And that is exactly what we're going to look at today. So let's get down to work with the actual reading, and we'll pick up with chapter 35, verse 1. Now, Moshe assembled the entire community of the children of Israel and said to them, These are the words that Adonai has commanded to do them. All right, nice introduction. For 6 days is work to be made, but on the seventh day there is to be holiness to you, or for you. Shabbat, Shabbat ceasing for Adonai. Whoever makes work on it is to be put to death. All right, so we get this interesting phrase, Shabbat Shabbaton, which Fox is translating as Sabbath, Sabbath ceasing, trying to emphasize the doubling up of the term, also emphasizing that Shabbat is not a proper noun per se. It is a regular noun that is based off a verb that is turned into a proper noun by its place in the week. And the underlying meaning of that word is to cease, to stop. It is a stoppage. So this is a stoppage, would be another way maybe to put it into English. And we get, again, this idea that anybody that does work will be put to death. As always, there are important restrictions upon such death sentences involving the evidentiary process, the witnessing process, the warning process, the judicial process. But yes, this is technically on the books. Just a little bit as an aside, when you read through later passages that talk about Shabbat violations, we only see one where somebody is actually executed, and even there it is still debated precisely why he was executed. But in later passages, especially in the book of Divrei Hayamim, where we see an issue with an entire city having basically people coming to market on Shabbat, the death penalty is not mentioned at all. So one should not think of this as being a common or desired occurrence. All right, verse 3, though, is where we get into our interesting little aside. You are not to let fire burn throughout all your settlements on the Sabbath day. Now, this phrase, do not let fire burn throughout, is, of course, up for a lot of discussion. It's not where we're going to focus our attention. Just for now, let me suffice it to say that it could either mean you should not kindle a fire in any of your settlements, or it could mean you should not allow fire to continue to burn, as Fox seems to be rendering it here. This was a major point of debate with the Karaite movement back in the early medieval period. I guess that would be the late what's the term? Because the Dark Ages fell out of favor. Look up the Karaites; you'll find the centuries I'm talking about and the debate. But what's important here is that having just told us not to do work, we are now being given an example of work. Is this meant to be an addition that would not have been included with the general prohibition on work? Is this meant to be merely illustrative of what type of work is being discussed? Does this serve some other purpose? That is what we have to try and figure out. And we are going to look at that, but I just want to point out that these first 3 verses do sort of stand alone, because with verse 4, we begin our discussion of the building of Mishkan again and talking about the gifts that were brought in order to make its construction happen. So this does feel like it's just sort of floating there. Again, this juxtaposition reinforces the previous juxtaposition of Shabbat and Mishkan as a way of knowing that we do not do the work of building the Mishkan on Shabbat, and thus we don't do any of that type of work on regular projects either. Okay, I know that's very short, little 3 verses, but there's a lot that can be said from that. We're going to take a look at them in order to unpack not just what they might mean, but also to perhaps get a better feel for how the rabbis of old would analyze verses, of how we take the Torah from the set text that we have and transform it into actual, usage. Because as simple as it might seem, it is deceptive. If you think that God is truly the divine author, and you think that God is, well, a perfect author, then there are certain questions that arise here. One of them would be, why did verse 3 come after we already had verse 2? It seems redundant. On top of that, why have this section at all when we've already discussed Shabbat previously, not only in the 10 Commandments, but in other contexts as well? Unlike a human author, where such redundancies might be accountable because of author error, or because author desired to simply repeat himself because, why not? In general, we refrain from describing any of the portions of Torah as being mere redundancies. As such, we need to probe it more deeply. Just one more example how the unfortunate ideology of many people that I'll just read the Bible and know what to do is very much a false notion. There's always a lot more work that goes into it than just decoding the words. So let's go ahead and take a look at how our rabbis handled that and some of the different interpretations and applications of these verses. So we're going to begin with what might be considered a sort of general understanding, not too far off from what the average person might come to if they were to think about this just a little. From Da'at Sikimin, the reason that the Torah singled out lighting a fire on the Sabbath as a forbidden activity by naming it is that to the average person, lighting a fire seems hardly as something that can be called work. If it had not been specifically singled out, people might have said that they would certainly not perform activities even remotely connected to creative activity, but they would never have dreamt that lighting a match would be considered by the Torah as on par with that of sewing, plowing, or kneading dough, for instance. So this is an idea that is often batted about, and I've often encountered where people will try to define the word melacha, the word work, as sort of a natural vocabulary word of what do I mean when I say work? And when we do that individually, we come up with a huge range of opinions. And generally, at least in modern English, most people define work as being something they'd rather not do, usually because it's quite laborious or difficult. As such, says Da'at Sikinim, when it comes to lighting a fire, since that is relatively simple and easy, then we need to spell out that even something as simple and mundane and trivial as lighting a fire is also prohibited on Shabbat. Don't think just because it's easy that it doesn't count as work. Work is a technical category linked to the construction of the Mishkan, and through the example of fire, we can see that it doesn't matter how many watts of energy you put into something, how many calories of yourself it burns. If it fits that category, it counts as work. So that explains why we have this seemingly unnecessary mentioning of fire by name when we've already talked about work in general, in order to prevent that internal interpretation of what does work mean. And indeed, like I said, when many people are discussing Shabbat with me and talking about how to be more observant, oftentimes I encounter this idea. Many people feel that they should be able to define work on their own as being something they don't want to do, but and also takes a certain amount of effort. That is not the correct definition. I will point out that if you are just beginning your Shabbat observance and Shabbat journey, by all means, that's not a bad way to start, but recognize it for what it is. It is a stopgap measure. Just like trying to learn how to hit a ball in a batting cage is probably an okay starting place, rather than stepping up to the plate in Major League Baseball for the first time without any practice. So too, there are some training wheels versions of getting used to refraining from melacha, refraining from work on Shabbat. And that's not a bad one. But we have to be very careful that we're not believing that our current definition is the actual technical definition, or else we're going to end up never progressing further and never experiencing the true freedom that Shabbat is meant to give. And that is going to be echoed as well by Sforno, as we see in our next commentary. Even though, generally speaking, lighting a fire is not a productive but a destructive activity, seeing that it is an almost indispensable ingredient in most activities the Torah prohibited, it is unsuitable for the Sabbath. So Sforno here is sort of parallel to Da'at Sechenim, but a slightly different emphasis, pointing out that many people will really take to heart the idea that we are prohibited from doing labor that is constructive, because after all, we were constructing the Mishkan. And, destroying something, well, that doesn't really count. And truth be told, many forms of destruction are, of course, allowed on Shabbat. Otherwise, we couldn't chew, for example. There are many things that we can do on Shabbat that are purely destructive, and that's okay. It's when there is a creative element that it becomes more problematic. Fire, he is saying, might feel like one of those purely destructive things, and thus I might feel that there is no reason not to do it. However, as he points out, yes, it may feel like it is mostly destructive, but generally speaking, fire is a productive element of many other prohibited labors, most notably cooking, for example. In classical Jewish understanding, cooking involves fire. And as such, if you light a fire, you are taking a step towards that type of a very clearly prohibited labor. So even though fire in and of itself might feel like it is just a destructive and thus possibly permitted activity, that's not the case. Again, when somebody is feeling curious about exploring Shabbat, one of the various mental mental rubrics they can come to is the idea of Shabbat as a limit on our creation. Same way that God refrained from creation back in the book of Genesis, so too we refrain from creation. Again, that is an imperfect definition, but it can be a useful one for those that are starting out, trying to see ourselves as imitating God in that way and recognizing that a human's worth is not entirely dependent upon what they produce. That's a very slippery slope into reducing our sense of self to being just a cog within a productive machine. And humans are much more important than that. All right. Now, Ramban is going to continue with this discussion of why this might have been separated out. So he takes, of course, our phrase, "You shall kindle no fire in your habitations upon Shabbat." The meaning of this verse is clearly to prohibit also on Shabbat doing any work necessary for the preparation of food. All right, it seems a little bit of a stretch, but you have to wait until he explains himself. So common with so many of our commentators, they state their primary proposition, and then it can feel like you are lost until they unravel exactly how they got there. So let's follow his thought process that the prohibition on fire is meant to be a prohibition on doing any work necessary for food. Now, what are the steps? Well, since he, meaning God, said, "Whoever does work therein shall be put to death," and he further explained that they should also not kindle fire in order to bake bread and boil meat, for fire is needed in the preparation of all food. All right, it's not exactly compelling just yet, right? He's saying, don't do any work and don't kindle fire. His argument is, well, kindling fire is for cooking of various things. Therefore, that is what is being prohibited here, not just the fire, but the cooking. Now, why would this be necessary? Well, this had to be stated because he did not say here, whoever does any manner of work, just as he had said in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not do any manner of work," but instead, he merely said work, without specifying any type. So if you compare the Ten Commandments language to the language that is found here, here we just had the word melacha, work, whereas in the Ten Commandments, we had any type of melacha being stated. As I said before, if God is a divine author, thus we have to believe that those differences in wording could be important. Now, one problem that comes from that proposition, that any differences in wording could be important, is that we might draw the wrong conclusion from seeing differences in the language. Thus, as he points out, as soon as I find where it is left off, therefore we might have, meaning this is an incorrect idea, but it might have been justified by the words if we had nothing else. We might have excluded from the general statement, whoever does work, all activity necessary for the preparation of food. For we find it said about Pesach that you shall not do any work on it, and yet the preparation of food is not included. It is for this reason that here he mentioned expressly that the preparation of food is also forbidden on Shabbat. All right, let me try and explain that again, because this is a great example of the rabbinic logical thinking that doesn't come naturally to many of us, but with a little practice will become almost second nature. And then you can impress your friends and family at parties. So what's going on here is Ramban is drawing our attention to a potential line of interpretation. We have the Ten Commandments saying, don't do any work. We have this line here in Exodus saying, don't do work and don't light fire. Well, we might, without that fire phrase, if that had not been included, we might have said, look, the Ten Commandments says don't do any, but this one just says don't do work. So maybe there is some gap between all types of work and this work mentioned here. And you know what? Now that I think about it, when we read about Pesach, it says that we can do work on Pesach that we need for the food, for eating on Pesach. And Pesach also said that we can't do any work. So, if we can't do work on Pesach, but we can do work for food, then here, when it says you can't do work on Shabbat, you know what? We probably can do work for food. But lo and behold, says Ramban, there's an extra sentence here that says don't light fires, which is going back to that most basic element of cooking and saying even from that start, we're not allowed to do it. And that is trying to remind us that Shabbat has a different set of rules than the regular rules that apply to Passover or other holidays. So I'm going to try that one more time, just trying to, continue to make sure that people can get it, because it's a really important way of looking at the text and one that our sages, not just Ramban, do in many, many places. So we have parallel texts that are similar in multiple places. We need to understand our topic by putting all of those texts together, lining up all the ones about Shabbat, lining up all the ones about Passover, and seeing where the differences are. Now, if we were to remove our fire line from our paragraph here in Exodus 35, then we would be left with a very strong parallel of don't do work on Shabbat, don't do work on Pesach. And then Pesach adds a line that says, but you do get to do work when it comes to food, which would make us think that don't do work means don't do work except when it comes to cooking, and that is thus implied even for Shabbat. However, our verse does include a prohibition on fire, and that has to be interpreted as well. And the interpretation of that is to rule out the Passover exemption regarding food and say that on Shabbat, you can't do that at all. So by putting these two together, we are able to avoid any mistakes by actually considering all of the pieces in the cycle. Very often we're tempted to read one line, maybe two if we're feeling brave, and come to our own unique interpretations. Ramban is reminding us through the vehicle of the rabbi's logical interpretation that you don't get to do that. Every verse is important and every verse has something to teach. And that's what this one is. It's ruling out that erroneous conception. All right. Now, we get to Rashi, and we're going to see that that's not the only way that we can talk about this, and that there are other things we can learn from this. So you shall not kindle a fire, our starting text. There are some of our rabbis, meaning the sages in the Talmud, who say that the law about kindling fire is singled out in order to constitute it a mere negative command, thus indicating that, like all other negative commands, its infringement is punishable by lashes, but does not make the offender liable to death, as does the doing of other work on Shabbat. So, because we've had the general statement, don't do work or you die, and then we have don't light fire, the logic would be thus not lighting fire must have a different feel to it, a different degree to it, under which it is, a different severity to it. And while it is still a prohibition, it is not included in that same line about you will die. Thus, it must just be a general negative command without any particular statement of punishment. And in such cases, when one violates that type of negative commandment, the punishment is lashes, is flogging, which is a whole nother conversation. You can watch my Mishnah class on Makot for much more about the use of corporal punishment. So that is a potential interpretation of why fire was made separate. Not that it was about cooking, not that it was about anything else, just in order to tell you that its punishment would be a different type. Others, however, because this is a debate in the Talmud, say that it was singled out in order to separate the various kinds of work comprised in the term kol melacha, all work, thus indicating that each transgression of the Shabbat law is to be atoned for separately, if several of them have been committed at the same time and under the same circumstances. And then we have a number of citations if you'd like to look this up in the Talmud directly. So the second interpretation here is that by making making fire mentioned all by itself, it is teaching us that the violation of Shabbat is not just one giant bucket of if you broke Shabbat, you then have to atone for it. But instead, it's if you broke this category of work or that category of work or that category of work, that you have to atone for each of them in their own way. That it is not enough to simply say, I broke Shabbat. It is instead, I broke the prohibition on fire. I broke the prohibition on writing. I broke the prohibition on cooking. And each one of those would require a different sacrificial and teshuvah, repentance for that deed. Again, you can go to my Mishnah class about Shabbat to see that discussed in much more detail. So we've now had three primary different ways of looking at this legally. One is that it is to make sure we know that we can't cook. One is to make sure we know that the punishment is slightly different. And another is to know that each category of labor is its own category with regards to repentance. Then we also had two different discussions of the emotion behind our decision-making on Shabbat, of thinking that something was important or unimportant or destructive or not destructive, and trying to help guide us in that as well. So we are going to change gears radically away from what you probably think is the normal topic that this Kindle Fire is about. So I just want to put a little pause here and double check if anyone is frantically typing on YouTube or if anyone is asking a question with our Zoom crew. I'm not seeing anything. That's okay. Okay, so hold on to your kippah. Things are going to get a little different. So we're going to jump into Mishnah Torah. This is Rambam's, that's Maimonides, as opposed to Ramban, who we talked about earlier. Magnum opus law code, trying to bring together all of the interpretations of law into short, succinct, and logical sentences. Punishments may not be administered on Shabbat. Although administering punishment fulfills a positive command of the Torah, we are commanded to have justice, the observance of a positive commandment does not supersede the observance of the Shabbat laws, meaning that even though we need to punish someone, that doesn't take priority over our requirement to observe Shabbat. What is implied? What does that mean? A person who was sentenced to be lashed or executed by the court should not be lashed or executed on Shabbat. As Exodus 35:3 states, do not kindle a fire in all your dwellings on Shabbat. This verse serves as a warning to the court not to execute a person by burning on Shabbat. Srefa, one of the capital punishments, involved a rather complicated form of burning. It is not the tie you to a stake witch trial style burning. Still not very pleasant, but much more instantaneous in terms of death than that type of torture. And that is what this verse is talking about. And the same principle applies regarding other punishments administered by the court. Okay, so Rambam is saying this phrase, don't kindle a fire on Shabbat, is not talking about cooking per se. It is not talking about separating out this or the other. It might be doing those things too, but primarily it is telling us that we are not allowed to execute or punish a person in any way on Shabbat. We can do it on Sunday, we can do it on Friday, but we cannot do it on Shabbat. And how do we know that? Because it says, don't make a fire on Shabbat. And that fire is referring to capital punishment. Well, one of the four main versions of capital punishment. And if we can't do that, then that means we can't execute. And that's its way of telling us in general that we cannot execute or apply punishment on Shabbat. Okay, now, mentally, hands up, who actually ever read this verse thinking that it was talking about capital or corporal punishment? My guess is there are not a lot of hands there that belong to people who haven't already read this commentary or others that are similar to it. But this is a fundamental principle of Jewish law, of Jewish interpretation, which is to say that if a verse feels extraneous, then there needs to be some other purpose to it. It is not just there because God was trying to meet a word count. This is not your fifth grade English essay where you just wanted to say very, 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 very in order to try and get up to the words that the teacher assigned. So if it's not just about fire in general, because that seems to be covered by work, then what's it telling us? Rashi already gave us a couple ideas that it was talking more about how we distinguish between the punishment of one type and another, or about how we categorize the different violations of the law for purposes of repentance. But Rambam is pointing out that the Talmud comes down universally on the idea that the primary purpose of this verse is talking about how we punish people. Now, Rambam is beautiful because he is short, succinct, and logical. It is a great place, by the way, to practice your Hebrew reading skills because his language is so clear and similar to modern Hebrew in a way that biblical Hebrew, for example, is not. However, he does often leave out more descriptive and explanatory text, which is why Sefer HaChinuch, which is strongly influenced by Rambam and comes later, is often a great companion when talking about these issues. And indeed, when we come to chapter 35 and we see our verse, what does he deduce as being the meaning of this verse? That the court not administer a death sentence on Shabbat. He doesn't list this as being a prohibition on cooking. He doesn't list this as being a prohibition on lighting a match. All of those are subsumed under the general statements of don't work on Shabbat. Instead, he sees this verse as first and foremost being a restriction on the use of the death penalty on Shabbat. And he explains in more detail what Rambam was talking about. So what is this prohibition? That the judges not administer sentences on Shabbat, meaning to say that they not kill on Shabbat one who has been made liable for the death penalty by the court. As it is stated from our verse here, you shall not kindle fire throughout your settlements on the Shabbat day. And the explanation comes about this, that the court should not burn someone who has become liable for burning, that was the appropriate execution method. And the same is true for the other death penalties, as we saw from Rambam. And it is correct for us to expound this thing from this verse. So he is aware that it doesn't feel natural to take verse 3 and jump to death penalties, but he believes it does make sense. Why? As behold, it is not necessary for itself. As behold, it is already written in another place, you shall not do work, Exodus 20, also known as the Ten Commandments. And kindling is for the sake of work. That's what making a fire is. It fits the category of work. So, as I pointed out multiple times, because repetition helps, that if it's not necessary to say it for itself, then it must be necessary for something else that is not immediately obvious to a casual reader. As such, the rabbis have to teach us what it is trying to say. And that's what it's trying to say. It is written to teach another matter, meaning about the death penalty. And let's go ahead and scroll this down. And they explained about it that it came to teach us this matter that we said, the death penalty issue. And this is the language of the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, one of the great early line-by-line discussions of the Midrash Halacha, the explanation of the legal implications of the text. The Mechilta is written, of course, about the book of Exodus. You shall not kindle fire. That is to say, burning was in the general category of forbidden work, yet it was specified in order to teach that just like burning is particular in that it is one of the death penalties of the court, and we see here that it does not push off the Shabbat, so too, all the other death penalties do not push off that Shabbat. So, first of all, just understand that this interpretation is now 2,000 years old rather than in the Middle Ages, because the Mechilta is a much earlier compilation. But the logic is, as we've been discussing, that burning may be a particular form of execution, but it does not push off Shabbat. You're not allowed to do it on Shabbat. And from that, we recognize that none of the other death penalties can be carried out on Shabbat either. All right, so that's the basic explanation. Now, Sefer HaChinuch, like I said, likes to bring additional things for us to think about and feel when discussing the different mitzvot. So he continues, rather than just leaving us with the technical details. It is from the roots of the commandment that God, may he be blessed, wanted to honor this day, that everyone find rest on it, even sinners and guilty ones. So, like I said, he wants to find meaning in this that extends beyond just the performance of the mitzvah, but reaching to, well, what should we learn? What should we feel? What should we understand from the mitzvah rather than its mere performance? And he is advancing the idea that by focusing and feeling the idea acutely here, that somebody that has been guilty of a crime that is deserving of the capital punishment, I mean, this is the worst of the worst things you can be doing, that nonetheless, even such people as that deserve Shabbat, that they deserve a day of rest, that they deserve not to be executed on that day. Now, notice that that is not the only option that he could have run with. He could have said that the court officials deserve the rest, that the court officials should get the day off, that they should not ruin their Shabbat by having to participate in an execution. But that is not the general thrust of rabbinic teachings on these topics. The rabbinic teachings about the death penalty are very consistent in trying to reinforce that even though the punishment for a person who has committed a certain crime might be death, that they are still a person who committed the crime. They are not just a guilty criminal that needs to be, murdered. And thus their dignity and here their spiritual opportunity to appreciate one more Shabbat is protected. There is a relevant parable about a great king who called the people of his state to a feast, such that he does not prevent its entryway to any man, meaning it's a feast for everyone. And after the day of the feast, he will administer justice. So too is this thing, as God, may he be blessed, commanded us to sanctify and honor the Sabbath day for our good and for our merit, as I have written above in the mitzvahs 31 and 32 within his compilation. And this is also from the honor of this day. So what he is using in that parable is, look, if the king invites everybody to the great feast, he's not saying, oh, but not the people who are going to be found guilty of murder and thus executed. They don't get to come. No, the great feast is for everyone. Everyone can be there. They can eat. They can be happy. And then the next day they'll be executed. That I'm not going to take away the joy of this moment, even from people that are deserving of the capital punishment. This is a very different way of looking at criminal justice than we often are familiar with. Many times people like to imagine those that are guilty of crimes suffering far beyond the actual punishment that has been meted out to them. In the modern world, where we imprison most of our criminals, many people are happy to think, happy to know, because it happens too often, that being in prison is a horrible suffering, terrible existence, where the abuse and violence can run rampant, as well as many other problems. The thing is, those were not the actual punishment that were decreed by the state. The state didn't say you should be sentenced to being abused and subject to violence for the next 2, 3, 5, 20 years. The state just said you lose your freedom for those years, that you have to go live in a prison, and that's where you're going to be. The actual additional negative conditions within a prison are not meant to be part of the punishment, or they would be part of the statute. They'd be in the law that they needed to feel and suffer that way. So too in Judaism, there are many punishments that are necessary to be carried out, but it does not say that the person should suffer. Indeed, our rabbis are very clear that even for the capital punishment, that there should be a minimal amount of suffering, other than that which is fundamentally unavoidable in the carrying out of the punishment. We have to be very careful that when we punish a person, we still consider them to be a person, and that we punish them, we only administer the punishment that has been commanded, not additional punishment that perhaps we want. In our zeal and in our anger, or in our quest for vengeance, we often want more to happen to a person that deserves punishment than the actual justice that God has told us to extend to them. And this idea that even on Shabbat, even the most wretched criminal still deserves Shabbat is, I think, a beautiful example of that. Notice as well that Judaism doesn't say you get off scot-free. It doesn't say, oh, I'm sure you didn't really mean to be that bad of a person. It's okay. We still punish people up to and including death when all the proper conditions have been met. But we are still punishing a person. We are not punishing something that is treated as subhuman. And Shabbat is one of those things that defines us as human beings, defines us as being more than just an animal that is scraping and scratching and clawing for life and limb all the moments of its life. But recognizing in that seventh day a special spirit that allows us to truly rise above our mere material existence. And that is something that is extended to all people at all times. All right, let me just check our YouTube feed and see if anybody was chatting away. Nope. We will wrap it up there. And I look forward to continuing these discussions, whether it be over Shabbat, if you're there at services in person, or next time that we study, or as always in the YouTube comments, or in email if you would wish to discuss something privately. Take care, everyone, and be well.